The automotive industry just suffered a massive blow of over $70 billion as they miscalculated grossly what the customers actually wanted to drive. The script has been flipped now for the EV sector with the reduction and elimination of incentives and the fact that customers were just not all that excited in the first place. Their entire plans to advance forward very aggressively by 2030 to see as many as 70 or 80% of the vehicles on the road to be EVs, and by the year 2035, every vehicle on the road was supposed to be electric vehicle powered, meant that the manufacturers and the entire automotive industry was pushing back on the actual car buyer, the people that want to buy these vehicles. Sell what the customer wants. I'm going to share a list of 10 of the biggest losers that are stuck paying the biggest bills to try to reverse course and try to introduce vehicles that the customers actually want. Let's get into it now. One of the biggest losers is a manufacturer that was literally betting the entire farm, and it's Jaguar, the JLR group. And I've owned an F-Type R and I love the car. But ever since they've tried to rebrand and introduce all-electric platform meant that they were pretty much giving up on all of their internal combustion engines. Great vehicles like the XJ, XJL, the F-Type, the E-Type are all great vehicles that were showing very high levels of popularity. But then Jaguar decided they wanted to rebrand, introduce an all-electric, ultra-luxury platform that they were convinced was the future that everybody wanted to buy. That's a big shocker because now, a year and a half later, we see they pretty much stopped production on everything ICE. You can't even find any kind of F-Pace. They're pretty much done. The F-Types are pretty much winding down as well. And really, the only thing left are I-Pace. Jaguar also decided to go on a hiatus, fire the designer, and of course, recorrect their course, realizing that they've made a drastic mistake. I actually personally had talked to an insider in Jaguar that said they're actually putting that brand hanging up the coat and not necessarily accepting the fact that they're a franchise dealer. In most cases, these Jaguar dealers now are hiding under the cloak of literally just Land Rover because they don't have a product to sell anymore, and they're waiting a year to see what settles out in the market. The problem is, there's much better, much cheaper alternatives, and many people just simply want to go back to the internal combustion engine. The next one we know is Ford, one of the biggest losers in this game. They went all in with the intention of trying to beat everybody to the punch. With the $35 billion loss, even the CEO admitted, you know what, it's time to get back, and it's time to give the customer what they're looking for. With write-downs and losses of $4.8 billion in 2025 alone, and the total of being $38 billion overall, meant that the writing was on the wall. With vehicles like the F-150 Lightning, trying to push and promote that product as being a full-size truck, trying to offer something that the construction worker wanted, somebody to haul their trailer with, and realizing in practical senses that they just weren't going to make the mustard. They didn't have the range, they didn't have the power, and even Ford admitted that they were losing money on the production of every single one of their F-150 Lightnings. On top of it, the Mustang Mach-E was also heavily incentivized just to try to move them out the door, and virtually everything that came out of Ford in terms of electric vehicle predominantly was a big losing proposition. They were even talking about going full-size HD trucks and realized, we better get while the getting's good and turn this course around. Since then, Ford's elected to retool and go back to the internal combustion engine for their full-size pickup trucks. They've also decided, hybrids are more what customers want. An advancement, a partial half step that gets you some of the economy, some of the improvements of EVs, but without giving up a range, lower cost in batteries due to their size. They were likely going to make these vehicles more affordable to own and as well to build. The next big loser is Audi, part of the VAG group, and we know Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche try to get ahead of the rest of the industry. But Audi made a vast mistake. They had troubles with reliability, durability. A lot of their vehicles like the e-tron GT just suffered all kinds of quality issues. Electronic gizmos and gremlins, charging problems. It meant that customers were not satisfied and they certainly weren't sold on the product. On top of it, they were exceedingly expensive, meant that nobody was really buying them, and they also had to be heavily incentivized for a period of time. So instead of entirely shutting off the lights on the program, they knew that shutting down factories, laying off workers meant that they have to do something. They have to continue on with their internal combustion engines, which is what Audi decided to do. So they're not shutting it off entirely, But in parallel and in tandem, they continue to develop their internal combustion engines to offer that product line for customers that just don't want to let go, like you and I. Car enthusiasts, that we like the turbo sounds. We like those engines that howl and make noise and vibrate in our seats. Engines that we can service ourselves. General Motors, another big loser with $7.6 billion loss on write-downs and losses overall, meant that they admitted to stay competitive, we have to turn the ship around. But they were also trying to get ahead of the game and trying to meet those targets and those demands by the government set to actually advance these full EV adoption by 2030, 2035. So like every other OEM, they were trying to get while the getting was good. Well, that just didn't work, and a lot of customers weren't buying it. They didn't want to spend on the high cost and development costs of a lot of these EVs, meant that they were just outright refused. Customers continued to scoop up old school, outgoing ICE vehicles while the EVs just sat. EV Hummers, the electric Hummers, as well as the full-size trucks, just sat on lots for 100 days. 300 days. They just did not sell until they were heavily incentivized. On top of it, GM also invested heavily in the massive Ultium EV platform and the aggressive production ramp. They really wanted to advance it very, very quickly. But like most customers realized that these EVs came at a significant cost, and they didn't want to foot the bill for a lot of the development costs for these electric vehicles. We know to develop the EVs, the technology, outsource the batteries meant a huge cost adder just to buy an EV. The non-electric vehicle version of any of these EVs were proven to be 50% the cost of a brand new EV. Compare a Buick Encore versus a Chevy Bolt EUV, and you'll find very quickly how much more money you're paying for that electric technology, and customers didn't want that. They didn't want the EV due to poor range, the poor cold weather performance, but on top of it, they just liked an engine that they're used to, that they can drive around. They don't feel like they're tethered to a pole, and they're not worried about surging power costs. So as a result, they didn't give up entirely on their EV production, but rather they slowed it. And the decision to come out with more hybrid technology and restart and retool the ICE truck production. I mean, GMC and Chevy, we know trucks are their bread and butter, and they knew they couldn't give those up entirely. Otherwise, they pretty much kissed their business goodbye. Remember that bailout many years ago GM went through? They were staring down the barrel of the next bailout. Now, BMW, sadly, also had to get on. Now they have the new class, which is an improved and enhancement and really is a dedicated EV opportunity. But prior to that, they were utilizing the CLAR platform, which is essentially shared ICE or EVs, and really trying to put all your eggs in one basket meant that they failed miserably. It cost them billions of dollars in the development costs, and it just wasn't as efficient as some of the dedicated platforms you see from some of their competition. BMW has always said that they're not entirely giving up their ICE platforms with some of the M cars, but now we're looking down the barrel of something developing, and that's right, the new M cars that may be exclusively electric powered. So while BMW is further developing their electric vehicle program, they're slowing the pace of creating an obsolescence of their outgoing internal combustion programs. Everybody who drives a BMW loves the way they drive. I've driven many. I've owned many BMWs myself, and it's always the heart of the beast. Whether it's the V10 or the N55 or the S58, all those engines bring a certain soul and experience to the driving experience. You make that go away, why drive a BMW? Might as well drive a vacuum cleaner, and that's how a lot of customers said. See, the buyers have spoken. They want their internal combustion vehicles, and BMW has finally listened, at least for as long as possible, at least until the government officials and the regulators start pushing a little harder. But for the time being, it looks like they've got a little extra time. The next big loser is Stellantis. Their former CEO really got on the bandwagon, realizing he was putting one foot in Europe and one foot in North America. While he was vastly ignoring the customer base in North America, it was all a flop. Pushed, in fact, so aggressively that he, in fact, pushed himself at the door due to the biggest failure in automotive history at about a $26.5 billion write-down cost while they tried to correct what was wrong. Yes, with Fiats and Jeeps and Rams and Chrysler, which only is a minivan these days, the brand was really struggling. They were making everything from EVs to plug-in hybrids. And you think about a Jeep Wrangler or a Jeep Grand Cherokee that was a plug-in hybrid. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but then they went to pure EV. They were going to go with the Recon, which was going to be a plug-in only EV. How do you like that? A Jeep that you're going to plug into a tree? And customers spoke. They want a Jeep that's versatile, rugged, As soon as you have to plug in every 120 miles, there goes your off the grid. You've got to hustle back to the city to plug into a fast charger. Most customers realized that that wasn't what they were looking for. Jeeps need to be simple, rugged, and robust. And Stellantis was doing everything in their power to change that over. Stellantis decided to kick great engines like the Hemis, the V8s, and sent them all packing. They came out with cars like the Challenger and Charger EVs. What a failure that was. And a big part of the change was all of the individual dealers, the franchise dealers, were putting immense heat and pressure on the OEM, saying, look, we can't sell these products. They're too expensive. Sticker prices were raising during that time. Customers said, you know what? This is supposed to be a bread and butter, ma and pa kind of working person's vehicle brand, and yet they're charging BMW and Audi levels of cost for their EVs. Nobody was getting on board. And of course, these vehicles sat and sat and sat. And of course, with floor plan costs associated with all of these vehicles, every franchise dealer was starting to lose money. So all that pressure against the OEM said, we need to get back down to brass tacks. And so Stellantis kicked the old CEO out the door and started to right what was wrong. The Volkswagen Group, another big loser. Yes, the Volkswagen ID Buzz and the ID4, absolutely massive flops. You know, in the world of EVs, people, if they're even going to consider it, need good range, they need reliability, and they need something that's cost effective. The problem was this wasn't any of the above, and nobody was buying them. The Buzz just sat. It seemed like a fun retro idea with their little minivan, but nobody was buying them. Nobody cared. And with the $3.5 billion impairment and operating losses, their massive MEB platform push was just an eternal flop. And Volkswagen went through a struggle too, with thousands of workers getting laid off, closing plants that had been open for decades, and now realizing that we better do the rethink here. The approach of more hybrids, finding the halfway spot, is a lot of what manufacturers are seeking these days, just like Ferrari. You know, Ferrari, even Porsche came out with that supercar, and then they said, you know what, we're going to pump the brakes on that. Just like Lamborghini, they were going to have a pure EV supercar. They pumped the brakes on that. Now, for everybody is starting to really pump the brakes on these very expensive, ultra exclusive, high priced, high dollar luxury vehicles. There was a myriad of all kinds of carry-out issues. Of course, electronic gremlins, high cost versus some of the new Chinese vehicles that were coming out, and the timing was just absolutely brutal for Volkswagen. And the poor profitability versus the ICEs that they were selling meant that nobody was buying them, and they were almost on the verge of losing money on every single one. And on top of it, Volkswagen still licking their wounds over the Dieselgate scandal meant that the struggles were real, and they really had to look at the bottom line. The next big loser was Mercedes-Benz, and we see EQS, EQEs, they weren't selling. And the few that did, when they hit the secondary market, they were as little as 50% of what they were new. And that was after 1 year. Nobody was buying them. Nobody wanted them. Quality issues. And while they were lovely to drive, there was no interest in that level and high dollar amount for a luxury EV. Rather, most Mercedes-Benz owners and enthusiasts generally gravitated to the big V8 twin turbo engines, which was another problem which was mounting, and Mercedes-Benz, in conjunction with the EV development, was also developing a lot of turbo 4s and replacing some of their outgoing twin turbo V8s. For example, the C63S with the 4-liter twin turbo V8 from previous generation was an absolute amazing gem, and the engine before, the NA 6.2-liter V8, was even better. Since then, they decided, you know what, we're going to make a faster, better car. They put a little 2-liter turbo 4 and a hybrid, made it quicker, faster, but nobody wanted it. The quality wasn't there. It squeaked, it rattled, and it didn't have the sound and the punch that the older V8 engines had, and nobody bought them. Mercedes was learning the hard way that nobody wanted smaller turbo 4s replacing V8s. Nobody wanted EVs, and that's why the brand was struggling with multi-billion-dollar losses. An industry-wide write-down pool, Mercedes' approach to the EV first was one of their biggest mistakes they ever made. And I get it. You've got to advance, you've got to make advancements and innovation, all of that. But clearly they were a little bit too much, too aggressively, and there wasn't enough warming period for Mercedes. So as a result, we're starting to see them retract. They're already talking about maybe bringing back the V8s for some of their AMG cars. They're already talking about introducing more hybrid technology rather than pure EV. So they're going to satisfy a much broader audience. And the EV market will likely continue on in parallel, but at least they'll have customers that they weren't kicking to the curb and sending them somewhere else, like BMW land. Let's be honest, a lot of Mercedes owners are loyalists, and they're brand loyalists, and they love what they love, and that's V8s and V12 engines. You start pulling those engines and those drivetrains out of the lineup, say bye-bye to your business model. Honda, another big loser, $15.7 billion. on write-down costs. Some of the biggest mistakes they made was retrofitting, coming out with models that we once loved that were ICE, and now they weren't. They were going to be EV. For example, the Acura RSX EV. Nobody wanted that. The old RSX was absolutely a great little car. And the Zero series, a Zero it was indeed, and it didn't do very well, and nobody was really getting all that excited. It wasn't much of a buzz, and that really hurt Honda. And ultimately had to rescale and peel back some of their EV plans, saying not necessarily give up altogether, but saying, you know what, we need to delay this a little bit more. Have you heard the latest? The possible Civic Type R. Yes, 2.4-liter turbo 4-cylinder with a manual. Absolutely awesome. They're stepping up the game. It's good to hear that Honda might be rethinking this whole game and introducing some really hot internal combustion engines. And see, the unfortunate reality, what we started to see with a lot of these OEMs was an interim measure. While they transitioned from ICE to EVs, they were introducing all these junky little poorly built vehicles that had small engines, direct injection, turbo 2-liter engines that weren't producing what the previous V6s and V8 engines were in the entire industry as a whole. And Honda, like every other brand, was just creating products just more as a filler while they transitioned to the next stage. But obviously, with the development costs of EVs, meant that there was corners cut, in my own personal opinion. You can look at a late model Mercedes-Benz, late model BMW, late model any car, and the quality feels like it's down from what it was even 5 or 10 years earlier. And a big one of my favorites. You know, the Porsche 911 has always been one of my favorites. I've got one still to this day. I love the car, I love the brand, but they screwed up hard. And when Porsche enthusiasts talk, they make noise. And when they make noise, things happen. But even Porsche, you know, they thought they knew better than the customer for a while. They even removed vehicles like the wonderful Cayman 718 or the Macan, and they were going to say, we're going to convert those entirely to EVs. Well, guess what? That was a flop because they ultimately retracted, seeing that Porsche last year lost about 99% of their profits. They made almost no money last year because they were advancing their EV industry too aggressively and nobody wanted it. Even with some of their 911s, they're using hybrid technology or electric turbochargers. And while that might be a bit of an advancement, at least it retracts back to an internal combustion engine, which what the true enthusiasts of Porsche really love. Porsche recently saw a $1.1 billion quarterly loss and about a $3 billion restructuring cost associated just to get back on the track. Now, allegedly, there's talk that they might introduce both an ICE and an EV version of the Macan as well as the 718. Yes, bring that gas engine back. That's what we asked for. That's what we want. So billions have been spent across the industry, over $70 billion between all of these big losing manufacturers that were just trying to get ahead, trying to look at the mandates by 2030, 2035. But guess what? The customer speaks. I mean, even Ferrari is now looking. People were complaining about the haptic and capacitive controls. Even they have elected to put back some physical buttons on the steering wheel of some of their new hybrid vehicle, like the 296, the SF90, the Cylindri. A lot of these cars now are coming back with an upgrade or a retrofit to actual hard buttons because people were complaining and a pure EV in that sector just doesn't make sense. Customers want to hear that engine. They want to hear that roar of that drivetrain. Without it, they're not a Ferrari. They're not a Lamborghini. They're not a Porsche. Finally, it's about time these manufacturers have listened to what the customers actually want. Again, as always, right there, check out that video. You're going to find out the best vehicles I would buy, the most reliable if you're looking to buy something maybe slightly previous, right there. The most reliable and the worst reliable right there. Let's hope to see each and every one of you real soon, everybody. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.